He found a hidden entrance in the mountain and climbed down. But when he looked inside, his breath stopped. What was hidden in that dark tomb was never meant to be seen by outsiders. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments which country you're watching from. Aaron had always believed that a person's true voice could only be heard in silence. Not the human kind of silence, interrupted by traffic, phones, or idle chatter, but the silence that lived where the sky met stone. The mountains were the only place where he didn't feel compelled to pretend that he fit into a world full of expectations. Their cold air stripped away the unnecessary, leaving him with nothing but his heartbeat and the crunch of gravel beneath his boots. Up here, he was honest. Up here, he was free. He moved with the confidence of someone who had spent more years of his life climbing than speaking about climbing. His steps were steady and efficient, each movement calculated to preserve energy. He carried a pack neither too heavy nor too light, carefully balanced and secured, his gloved hands occasionally adjusting the strap to relieve the pressure on his shoulders. His jacket was weather-torn from countless expeditions, his boots seasoned by wind, ice, and rock. A faint trace of chalk and dust seemed permanently embedded under his fingernails. Every piece of gear he owned held the stains and scars of previous battles. To Aaron, solitude was not loneliness. It was clarity. While others felt uneasy when left alone with their thoughts, he embraced the silence that accompanied the sky's vast expanse. The mountains weren't obstacles to conquer, they were companions. They listened. They judged only by one rule: respect. In their presence, he never felt small. He felt connected to something greater than the chaotic world below, something ancient and unashamed to show its true nature. In the city, he was an outsider. There, conversations felt like negotiations and smiles like masks. Every noise seemed determined to remind him he didn't belong. Down there, people moved quickly without purpose, lost in routines they didn't question. Aaron never understood how they could live surrounded by millions and still be terrified of being alone. For him, the cities were cages without walls, but here, in the silence of the Andes, he was home. Sometimes, when he set up camp under a canopy of stars, he remembered how his fascination with the mountains began. He was 5 years old the first time his father came home from a rescue mission in full uniform. The old man, tall and broad-shouldered, had removed his gloves, revealing hands cracked by frost and rope burn. His son had stared at him with wide-eyed admiration as his father knelt and ruffled his hair. There was something in those tired eyes: pain, exhaustion, sacrifice, but also a fire that spoke of purpose. His father had saved lives that day. That look, that unspoken pride, became Aaron's compass. His father, Benjamin Hayes, had been a mountain rescuer, a man who gave everything to ensure others returned home safely. The mountains respected him because he respected them first. He had a way of speaking about his work that made even the most terrifying conditions sound honorable. He never claimed to be a hero. He simply answered when the mountains called for help. People trusted him because he would never abandon someone in need, not even when the odds were against him. Aaron grew up listening to stories about rescues gone right and those that ended in tragedy. He learned that the mountains could be beautiful and cruel in the same breath. His father taught him that climbing wasn't about proving anything, it was an agreement. If you respected the mountain, it might let you pass. If you underestimated it, you would pay the price. The day everything changed, Aaron was 13. His father left for a rescue mission involving a group of hikers trapped on one of the most treacherous routes in the Andes. The weather reports predicted worsening storms, but staying behind and waiting was never his father's way. He promised to return by nightfall. He didn't. Aaron remembered the knock on the door, his mother's crying, the cold official words. He must have slipped. We were unable to recover the body. A final report stamped and filed, as if his father's life could be reduced to a single mistake. There were no belongings returned, no location revealed, no grave to visit. Just a story without an ending. Nothing about it sat right with him. His father wasn't a man who simply made fatal missteps. If he had fallen, Aaron wanted to know why. If he had died, he deserved to be remembered correctly. What haunted Aaron most wasn't the loss. It was the unanswered questions. Years passed, and that unresolved truth rooted itself deep within him. He became everything his father had been, a climber, a mountain man, but instead of saving others, he climbed alone, always searching for the edges of a mystery that no one else seemed interested in uncovering. Now, standing at the foot of the very range that took his father from him, he felt something heavy settle in his chest. This was no longer just another climb. It was a pilgrimage into the heart of a secret that refused to stay buried. He had studied every scrap of information he could gather. He learned the route his father's team had taken, a path known among mountaineers as cruel and unpredictable, avoided by most who valued their lives. It wasn't marked on common maps, and the few rescuers who remembered the mission spoke about it quietly, as if the mountains themselves could overhear. The terrain was notoriously unstable, with sudden drop-offs and rock slides that came without warning. But it was the last place his father had been seen alive. Aaron was determined to walk where he had walked. His preparations were meticulous. He conditioned his body for months, running at dawn, climbing walls of indoor gyms with weighted vests, refining his rope techniques, and spending nights in simulated high-altitude environments to acclimate to the thin air he would soon face. He updated his gear, though some items he insisted on keeping despite wear and tear. They reminded him of his father's lessons and victories. His pack contained everything he needed: ropes, harness, carabiners, ice axes, crampons, emergency shelter, first aid supplies, spare batteries, rations, water purification tablets, and a compact stove. Before leaving, he triple-checked every clip, buckle, and knot. He hadn't slept much the night before departure. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the small hostel room at the base town, listening to the wind brewing outside. His mind replayed memories like old film strips, the laughter of his father lifting him into the air, the lessons about courage whispered before bedtime, the final wave goodbye. His mother's voice echoed faintly too, pleading with him not to go, fearing she would lose the only remaining piece of her husband. But some journeys were carved too deeply into the soul to resist. At dawn, the sun stretched long shadows over the rocky ridges. The air was crisp, biting, yet invigorating. A few hikers crossed his path, offering brief nods of acknowledgement. Most avoided eye contact when they noticed the solitary rope coiled across his shoulders. They could sense determination in him, see it in the way he walked, a man with a mission. The first miles were manageable, a slow incline across gravel and scattered patches of snow. Each step brought new altitude, new cold, new views of jagged peaks cutting into the sky like blades of stone. Glacial winds howled through narrow crevices above, carrying the scent of frozen water and ancient earth. Aaron absorbed the landscape with equal parts admiration and caution. Where others saw danger, he saw truth. The mountains never pretended to be anything other than what they were. Throughout the morning, he pushed higher, tracking markers barely visible against the ever-whitening terrain. He paused occasionally, not for rest but to reflect. He tried to imagine his father here, breathing hard against the thin air, pushing through fatigue with a stubborn resolve no storm could break. The thought warmed him, strengthening his legs when the incline grew sharper. The air thinned the higher he climbed. His lungs expanded to their limit, forcing cold oxygen through his blood like fire and ice. He welcomed the burn as a reminder that he was still alive. Every now and then, a gust of wind struck with sudden ferocity, swaying him slightly. It was a warning. The mountains were testing him. Clouds gathered slowly above, creeping across the blue sky like wolves circling prey. The temperature dropped. The trail narrowed to a ledge barely wider than his boot. One side was a towering rock face, rough and cold beneath his fingertips. The other side was emptiness, nothing but a sheer fall into white mist. Aaron adjusted his stance, leaning slightly toward the wall, ensuring each foot placement was secure before shifting his weight. A few loose stones tumbled off the edge, disappearing without a sound. He glanced into the abyss, but didn't allow fear to take hold. Heights didn't scare him. What scared him was never knowing the truth. He reminded himself why he had come. This wasn't recklessness. It was dedication. It was loyalty. It was a debt he owed to a man who had given everything. Something flickered at the edge of his awareness, a shift in the air, a subtle change in the wind's voice. He tightened his grip on the rock face, sensing a storm forming faster than predicted. Yet he continued, because turning back now would mean accepting the silence the world tried to impose on his father's memory. The mountain felt larger now, looming like a living thing. But Aaron didn't shy away. If these peaks held the answers he sought, then he was ready to face whatever truth they revealed, even if it tore him apart. Ahead of him lay a route few dared to take and fewer survived to speak about. The path would only grow narrower, the air colder, the risks heavier. But he pressed forward, one slow and deliberate step at a time, unaware that the mountain was already preparing to unlock its first secret, a secret that began with a slip of stone and the sudden roar of the wind. For the first time in his life, Aaron felt that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The wind arrived first as a whisper, brushing lightly against the back of Aaron's neck, lifting the edges of his hood. He paused for a moment, narrowing his eyes at the shifting sky. The clouds that had once clung lazily to the distant peaks now crawled downward with renewed hunger, darkening the horizon and thinning the light that reflected off the snow patches scattered along the ridge. Aaron tightened the straps of his pack and continued forward, each step precise and measured, mind and body prepared to meet whatever the mountain chose to reveal. Hours had passed since he'd left the relative safety of the lower slopes. Now he found himself on one of the most unforgiving parts of the route. A narrow ledge gouged into the side of the mountain with no rail, no rope lines, nothing but stone, wind, and the sheer drop yawning beneath him. Even the air felt sharper here, as though the atmosphere itself sharpened into knives the higher he climbed. He could feel the altitude clawing at his lungs, each breath slower and heavier, a reminder that he was pressing into territory where only the strongest or most foolish ventured alone. Aaron pressed his gloved hand against the cold rock for stability as his boots carefully sought the next secure foothold. He listened, because listening often saved lives up here. One could hear danger before seeing it. His father had taught him that. The mountains spoke constantly, but only to those willing to pay attention. The slightest trickle of falling pebbles might mean the approach of a larger collapse. A sudden stillness in the wind might signal the gathering of a storm. Most climbers underestimated how alive the mountains were. Aaron never made that mistake. He could almost feel his father's presence in every gust that pushed against his body. It wasn't a comforting sensation, but rather a demanding one, as if the very path insisted he prove himself worthy of walking where the old rescuer had walked before. Aaron had chosen this route exactly because it was dangerous, because it was here that his father had vanished, swallowed by mystery and stone. And if this was where the truth was buried, then this was where he would go, no matter how narrow the ledge, no matter how steep the drop. The wind grew stronger, tearing at his jacket and howling around him like an ancient beast awakening from sleep. He planted his feet and leaned toward the wall, using his body as a shield against the invisible force that threatened to shove him into the abyss. A faint tremor of fear curled in his stomach, not panic, but awareness. This was the kind of wind that had the power to decide fates. He exhaled slowly, centering himself. Courage was never the absence of fear. Another lesson his father had taught him, only the willingness to move in spite of it. Just a few more meters and he would reach a broader section of the trail. The thought propelled him, giving his muscles the determination they needed. But the mountain, ever unpredictable, had its own plans. Without warning, a violent gust slammed into him. The force was so sudden that his balance faltered. His boots skidded on the loose gravel. He stretched his hand forward to catch himself, but the rock he grabbed was smooth and offered no hold. His heart lurched as his body teetered over empty air. Desperately, he shifted his weight toward the inside of the ledge, his foot scraping against the rock until it caught on a small protrusion. He managed to steady himself, his chest pressing tightly against the wall as wind roared past like a freight train. He closed his eyes for a second, letting adrenaline pulse through him. That had been close, too close. And yet, the mountain wasn't finished. The gale intensified, swirling with a furious determination as though intent on removing him from the cliff once and for all. The rock under his right foot shuddered. This time his mind registered the sound. Stone grinding against stone. His eyes snapped open just as he pushed off from the wall, scrambling back. But he moved a fraction of a second too late. The large boulder that formed part of the ledge broke free. The ground beneath him lurched. His boots lost contact with solid footing, and suddenly he was falling. The world became a chaos of wind and motion. He swung wildly, his pack tangling with his limbs, his shoulder slamming painfully against the rock face. Instinct and training took over. He drove the spike of his ice axe into a crack on the wall, and his body jerked to a violent stop. The sudden halt tore a raw cry from his throat as his arm stretched to its limit and a sharp jolt of pain shot from his wrist up into his shoulder. He hung there for a moment, heart pounding unevenly in his chest, breath ragged. The huge rock chunk tumbled downward, hitting other stones along the way with thunderous bangs that echoed through the ravine. Aaron watched the boulder disappear into the waiting mist below, swallowed by the mountain's endless hunger. His breathing slowed enough for him to evaluate the situation. He wasn't falling anymore. That was the good news. The bad news was that his sudden drop had disrupted the mountain's fragile balance far more than he expected. Where the massive stone had rested, the cliff wall now showed something impossible. A wide rectangular slab of rock, too smooth, too even, too perfectly fitted to be natural. The boulder's departure had exposed a carved stone door. Adrenaline dulled the ache in his arm as he pulled himself upward with controlled, deliberate movements. His boots dug into the rock until he scrambled back onto a thinner but stable part of the ledge. He leaned heavily against the mountainside, gulping cold air, sweat forming despite the chill. His pulse hammered in his ears. He needed a moment to steady himself, but his gaze kept returning to the exposed shape within the cliff. Intrigue quickly replaced fear. This was not just a break in the mountain's formation. The angles were precise, forming a doorway long sealed by time. A stone slab, perfectly rectangular, fitted so tightly into the wall that it had blended seamlessly with its surroundings. The cracks around it were almost imperceptible, masked by centuries of dust and sediment. Had the wind not slammed him so violently and dislodged the boulder, he would have walked past without ever knowing it existed. His heart throbbed with something beyond the rhythms of survival: excitement, disbelief, a flicker of hope. He coiled his rope and wiped the snow dust from his gloves, the cold nibbling at his fingertips. The wind still lashed at him, warning that this was no place to linger exposed. He crouched beside the stone entrance, examining the edges more closely. Running his fingers over the outline, he felt the unmistakable handiwork of tools: chisel marks, deliberate shaping, a recessed grip faintly noticeable. It was a door carved into the mountain. The question of who built it lingered only a second before his mind jumped to a far more pressing thought. Had his father seen this? Had he fallen here, not through carelessness, but through the discovery of something hidden and dangerous? What if his father had tried to get inside? Or perhaps he had tried to protect something within. Aaron shook his head. He refused to lose control of his imagination. Facts first. Evidence. That was how his father worked. That was how Aaron needed to continue. He positioned his ice axe in the slight gap and pushed. The slab resisted, barely shifting under his weight. He braced his boots against the rock and tried again, feeling the cold metal handle bite into his palm as he forced all of his strength into the effort. The door groaned, ancient stone grinding in protest. Dust drifted into the air, swirling like gray ghosts in the wind. One more push. Muscles strained, breath hissed through clenched teeth, and then something inside the mountain yielded. With a long, drawn-out rumble, the stone slab shifted inward just enough to reveal a dark opening. A cold draft swept out from the gap, colder than the air outside. It carried the scent of moisture and something aged, earth that hadn't felt the sun in centuries. Aaron turned on his headlamp. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but revealed little more than rough-hewn walls stretching into a narrow corridor. The floor slanted downward. His pulse quickened. The mountain was not natural here. It held secrets, but secrets rarely came without danger. He anchored a safety line around a sturdy rock protrusion before widening the narrow opening with a few more deliberate strikes of his axe, each movement careful to avoid destabilizing the surrounding structure. When the gap was wide enough to allow passage, he paused again. He was not impulsive. Entering a hidden corridor inside a mountain was not a decision to make lightly. If the structure collapsed, or if something inside proved treacherous, no one would even know where to look for him. This wasn't a marked cave or a known archaeological site. It was a secret, sealed away until fate, or the mountain, chose him to reveal it. He inhaled slowly, tasting both fear and anticipation. If his father had discovered this place, then answers might lie within, answers that no official report had ever cared to dig for, answers to the silence that haunted Aaron for decades. He clipped his rope to his harness, secured his pack, and tightened his gloves. He cast one final glance at the sky above, the swirling gray, the restless wind, and then turned back to the darkness. The opening beckoned like a mouth ready to swallow him whole, but he stepped forward anyway, ducking his head to slip through the narrow space, careful and sure, crossing the invisible line between the world he knew and the one that awaited him inside. The mountain sealed the wind behind him, plunging him into near-perfect stillness. The faint sound of stone settling after centuries of stillness echoed through the corridor, a reminder that he was now somewhere human footsteps had not touched in a long, long time. Aaron's light cut ahead, revealing only a rough tunnel descending deeper into the stone. The darkness pressed close, like a silent witness to his intrusion. There would be no turning back now. Whatever truths the mountain held, he was finally inside them, and somewhere, deep within these ancient passages, the fate of his father and the reason behind his disappearance waited to be uncovered. The moment Aaron stepped through the narrow opening, the world behind him disappeared. Even the roar of the storm, so deafening seconds ago, vanished, as if the mountain had swallowed every sound. The silence was absolute. It pressed against his ears until he could hear nothing but the steady thump of his own heartbeat and the faint hiss of his breath filtering through the mask. His headlamp cut a pale line through the darkness, illuminating a tight corridor carved directly into the stone. The walls bore rough tool marks, strokes left by hands long gone, evidence of purposeful labor. This passage had not formed by accident. Someone, sometime, had shaped it intentionally. The floor sloped downward at a gentle angle, guiding him deeper. Each cautious step stirred ancient dust that rose into the air in slow, languid swirls. It tasted old, as though it had been undisturbed for a lifetime or longer. Aaron's boots scuffed against stone, echoing faintly ahead of him, and the sound returned distorted, hinting at larger spaces hidden beyond the narrow start of the tunnel. The temperature dropped quickly. The chill slid beneath his layers, clinging to his skin like icy fingers. His breath turned to vapor that lingered briefly before fading into the shadows. He paused only once to adjust the rope anchoring him to the outside world, giving it a small tug for reassurance. The line held firm, disappearing into the shrinking sliver of light behind him, the only visible connection to the living world, but with every step forward, that glow faded. The stone door crept back into place as the wind outside settled, the passage tightening its grip on him. Soon there was no sign of the entrance, and Aaron knew that to escape he would have to find his own way. Strangely, he did not panic. Curiosity, exhilarating, daring, drove him onward. The corridor widened little by little until he found himself stepping into a chamber that towered high above, its ceiling lost in the shadows beyond his headlamp's reach. At first, his light revealed only jagged rock and empty expanses, but then something caught his eye, a glint of reflection that did not match the stone. He swung the beam toward it and froze. A row of shapes lined the walls. At first glance, they resembled simple piles of rocks, but the closer he looked, the clearer the horror became. Bones. Human bones, carefully placed, cradled by carved niches in the wall. Some skeletons still wore remnants of clothing that clung stubbornly to the bone, fabric shredded and faded but unmistakably modern in design. Zippers, buckles, fraying nylon straps. Here and there, older attire appeared. Leather boots cracked and brittle with age, woolen jackets half-eaten by time. The lantern of his father's stories flickered violently inside him. He knew this was no random resting place. Someone had brought these people here. His breath hitched as he stepped closer to the nearest set of remains. The skull rested peacefully atop folded arms, as though the person had been placed with care rather than left to decay. Beside the bones, propped delicately upon the stone shelf, lay a small book, its edges warped with moisture but still intact. He reached for it slowly, almost reverently, and brushed the dust away. A notebook. The cover bore a name, one he did not recognize, but the ink remained legible, protected by the cold, dry air of this hidden tomb. He thumbed through the first few pages. Notes scrawled in hurried handwriting. Dates, coordinates, observations of weather and altitude. And finally, toward the back, a short message addressed to a family member. A farewell. A confession of fear, hope, regret, a plea for forgiveness and remembrance. Aaron closed the book gently, placing it back exactly where it had been. The notebook wasn't just a record, it was a life preserved at the edge of death. He moved along the wall, his light scanning the space around him. More skeletons, more belongings, a ring tied to a piece of string, a photograph, blurry but showing two smiling faces against a backdrop of trees, a cracked compass, its needle long stuck, a crushed metal cup. Every object told a fragment of a story, people who had tried to conquer the mountain and failed, or perhaps tried to escape something worse. And yet, everything was arranged with care. They had not simply perished here. Someone had given them a form of burial, a ritual of honor. Aaron swallowed hard, his throat tight. His father had told him once that mountains were both cradle and grave. They welcomed and devoured. They tested the will of humans who dared to challenge them. But he never imagined a place like this existed, a sanctuary beneath the surface, where the lost were given peace. But how? Who had placed them here? And why did no one speak of it? He walked farther into the chamber, feeling his heart pound like a drum as each new detail emerged. The air seemed to thicken with emotion, grief, reverence, silence heavy enough to make his chest ache. He wasn't intruding upon death. He was trespassing into a sacred memory. Even the echoes of his footsteps felt like an insult. One section of the chamber caught his attention more than the others. A cluster of remains that looked more recent, clothing not yet disintegrated, equipment bearing recognizable logos and certifications. His hand trembled slightly as he brushed the dust off a folded jacket sleeve and saw a stitched patch. Mountain Rescue. His pulse surged. He leaned in, scanning each item desperately, his heart driving him forward. There, half buried under a collapsed backpack strap, a glint of metal invited his shaking hand. He lifted it slowly. A rescue badge, tarnished but readable. His fingers tightened as he turned it over and saw the engraved name. Benjamin Hayes. His father. The air left his lungs in a hard, ragged breath. For a moment, the entire world shrank to the badge resting in his palm. It felt heavier than metal, heavier than truth. His father had been here. He had not fallen into some unreachable crevice, lost to the mountain's cold belly. He had found this hidden place. He had been a part of whatever had happened here. And judging by the placement of his gear, he had been acknowledged, given rest among others who had walked similar fates. Aaron stumbled back a step, pressing his free hand against his chest and closing his eyes. A wave of grief rolled over him, too large to hold back. He thought of his mother, who cried for years without closure. He thought of himself as a boy, wondering every night if his father had suffered, if he had died alone. He thought of the officials who said his father had been careless, that they might never recover his body. All lies by omission. Maybe they hadn't known, but the mountain had known, and now so did he. Breath by breath, he steadied himself. There was more to understand, The answer wasn't simply that his father had died here. Why here? Why alongside these others? And what were they all trying to do? His headlamp flickered over the surrounding artifacts as he searched for something else, something that could explain the chain of events. And then he saw it, tucked into a crevice beneath his father's remains, a packet of papers carefully wrapped in waterproof material. With gentle movements, he freed the bundle and unfolded it. A map of the mountain was revealed, hand-marked with red lines, danger zones highlighted with warnings. Accompanying the map were notes, coordinates, and times, possibly related to the final rescue. But there was more. A notebook. Not his father's official logbook. This one was personal. His hand shook again as he flipped open the cover. On the first page, written in familiar handwriting, he saw a date. His father's last day alive. The letters swam slightly as emotion threatened to cloud his vision, but he focused. This was no time to lose composure. Slowly, carefully, he turned the pages. The writing grew messier as the entries progressed. One entry mentioned the missing hikers from his father's mission, trapped by unstable rock. Another described the conditions worsening: avalanches, shifting ground, splitting stone. Then he came across the final entries, ones written in haste, but with clarity of thought fueled by fear and determination. His father had discovered this sanctuary during the rescue. The hikers had been unable to move due to injuries and exhaustion. The search route they followed had collapsed behind them, trapping them here. The mountain had turned the world into stone around them. They spent hours trying to create an escape path. His father realized the only remaining passage was dangerously unstable and would collapse if too many tried to pass. So he made a decision that only a man who understood the true meaning of sacrifice could make. He stayed behind to hold the mountain up long enough for the others to escape. Aaron's hands tightened around the journal as tears finally slipped from the corners of his eyes. His father had not died through mistake or misjudgment. He had ensured that others lived. He had given everything to protect those under his care, even if it meant he could never return. The official story had stripped the heroism from his death. The world may have forgotten, but the mountain had not. Aaron sank down onto one knee, the notebook resting against his thigh as he bowed his head. The chamber felt suddenly alive, as though every silent skeleton around him bore witness to his father's courage. Gratitude, sorrow, admiration, all fought for dominance inside him. But above all, there was a fierce, unshakable pride. His father had been a protector to the very end. A man of integrity, conviction, and heart. A man worthy of being remembered. When his breathing finally steadied and he wiped his face, he knew what he needed to do. He could not leave these journals, these photographs, these final messages hidden underground. They belonged in the sunlight, in the hands of loved ones waiting for closure. Each object in this sanctuary represented a life halted mid-sentence. Their stories needed an ending. Their families needed answers. His father had saved others. Now it was Aaron's turn to save their memories. He packed the journal and the map carefully into his bag, making sure the badge was secured close to his chest. He examined other journals and letters with the same respect, placing them gently into protective pouches, organizing them so they would survive the journey out. It felt sacred, like performing a ritual. He turned once more toward his father's resting place, touching the stone shelf lightly with reverence. He promised silently that he would return, when it was safe, to move his father to a proper resting ground. But for now, what mattered was delivering the truth. and that truth weighed more than any stone he had ever carried. When he finally stepped away from the chamber, stopping only to give a long, respectful nod to the silent witnesses around him, he understood that this climb was no longer about him. The mountain had demanded he prove his resolve. Now it had given him purpose. As he began the long walk back through the tunnel, the silence felt different. No longer heavy and oppressive, but watchful, almost guiding. The mountain had not led him here to die, it had led him here to learn. Behind him lay the secrets of the forgotten. Ahead of him lay a path to the truth. His father's story would be heard, and every soul resting in the sanctuary would finally be acknowledged. Aaron adjusted the strap of his pack, strengthened by the weight of the stories it carried. His light guided him towards the faint promise of an exit, but something told him that even once he stepped into daylight again, the mountain's revelations were far from over. He kept moving, because stopping here meant allowing the silence to win. He moved because his father had fought so others could walk free. And now Aaron walked so his father and the many who lay beside him would never again be lost to the dark. The quiet of the tunnel followed him as he continued deeper, each step echoing back like a conversation between him and the ancient stone. The remnants of grief and shock from the discovery in the sanctuary still pulsed inside his chest, but another sensation had begun to surface: resolve. What he had found behind him was bigger than loss. It was revelation. His father's story had not ended the way the reports had claimed. It had not ended with failure or silence. His father had stood his ground against impossible circumstances and given everything he had for others. And now Aaron carried that truth on his shoulders, protected within his pack like sacred relics. Yet he knew that understanding the final sacrifice was only part of the mystery. There were still unanswered questions lurking in the cold corridors ahead. When he had turned away from his father's resting place, he had noticed something peculiar in the way the skeletons were arranged and the objects were left behind. It wasn't random. It wasn't hurried. Someone had taken the time to honor these lost climbers. Someone had carved the niches, placed their belongings carefully beside them, preserved the proof of who they once were. The sanctuary itself felt like a monument, a hidden archive built by hands that respected the souls it guarded. So, who kept this place? And why did the mountain allow it to remain a secret? His headlamp flickered over the stone walls as he pressed forward, revealing faint carvings etched into the rock. They stretched along the corridor in long lines and intersecting symbols, some barely visible beneath centuries of dirt. They weren't decorative. They seemed like markers, warnings or directions written in a language no longer spoken above ground. Aaron brushed the dust from a series of overlapping shapes, noticing the repetition of a single mark, a curved line intersected by three straight ones, reminiscent of a mountain peak pierced by light. It appeared again and again, guiding him deeper. Ahead, the tunnel split into two paths. The left road dipped even further down, air damp and swallowing, while the right rose slightly, the ground less worn from footsteps of the dead. His instinct nudged him right. If there were answers still to uncover, they were more likely in a place where the living had once carried the burden of duty. He adjusted his grip on the rope, still tied to him. Though it now stretched much farther back, its presence gave him comfort, a promise that he had not fully lost the path back. The gradual ascent opened into another chamber, smaller than the sanctuary but dense with remnants of human presence. Rusted tools lay scattered on the ground, bits of wood and hammerheads, a few chisels, coils of ancient rope. There were also fragments of old lanterns and candle stubs melted into stone, remnants of lights that must have burned long ago. Against one wall stood a stack of wooden boards, warped with age, yet some still adorned with faded symbols matching the ones carved into the stone. Aaron knelt and traced the edges of one plank, trying to guess what had been constructed here. It was too deliberate, too human to be part of the mountain's natural shape. He continued his search with heightened awareness, eyes scanning every surface for more clues. The walls bore markings like those he'd seen before, though these were more organized and deliberate. Squares and grids, measurements, notes in languages he didn't recognize. Someone had surveyed this place, documented it, perhaps even protected it as sacred ground. This chamber felt like the backbone of the sanctuary, a location for the caretakers of the dead. A leather-bound ledger lay crumpled near the center of the chamber, its pages brittle and yellowed. He gently lifted it and turned the cover. Much of the text inside was faded beyond recognition, but a few sections remained legible. Names of those who were placed in the sanctuary, descriptions of their final days. A careful record, preserved here in the dark. His eyes paused when he reached a more recent entry. It listed members of a rescue mission, his father among them. Dates matched the timeline he had known from the official reports, but more details filled the margins. Injuries sustained by the hikers, weather conditions, and then instructions. If the mountain seals itself, preserve the honor of the lost. No one is to be abandoned to the fall. Below the ink, someone had scratched a note hastily. He held the passage long enough. They escaped. We recorded it. The mountain knows. Aaron's throat tightened. This ledger confirmed what his father had written, but also revealed that others from the mission had known. They had recognized his sacrifice and tried, in their own quiet way, to preserve the truth. But why hadn't this record been brought back? Why hadn't his father's honor been restored publicly? The answer came as he flipped further. A later note, the handwriting tense and uneven. We cannot open the way again. The entrance is lost, buried. We swear to keep this sacred so the mountain remains guardian. If others come, let them be those who understand the price. Aaron stared at the words, the meaning sinking in like cold water through layers of clothing. No one outside had known about this place because the very people who recorded the truth had chosen to keep it hidden. They hadn't expected anyone to find the entrance again, not without the mountain's permission. And so his father's story had become a casualty of their vow. He sat down on a protruding rock, feeling the weight of the revelation settle over him. The rescuers had wanted to protect the sanctity of the dead, but in doing so, they had condemned his father's memory to doubt and misunderstanding. Aaron did not know whether to feel anger or gratitude. Perhaps both emotions had equal claim to his heart. His breathing slowed as he examined the remaining parts of the chamber. More evidence existed here. Maps carved into the stone itself, showing hidden tunnels and burial sites far beyond what he had yet explored. The sanctuary was only part of something larger. A network. A purpose. It made sense now, the way the bodies had been arranged, the personal effects preserved, the messages left behind. It wasn't a graveyard. It was a shrine, a tribute, a final refuge for those who had given themselves to the mountains and never returned. And his father had chosen to enter it knowingly. Aaron rose, once more gripping the notebook and the ledger, and turned toward an alcove on the far side of the chamber where scattered gear hinted at more recent visitation. Amid the rubble, a familiar type of carabiner gleamed dully. Modern issue. It lay beside a cracked helmet with a rescue insignia still faintly visible. A coil of rope had been slashed cleanly near the end. His father had not been alone when the passage collapsed. Others had survived long enough to leave records behind, handwriting frozen in time. He ran his fingers along the edges of a torn jacket sleeve, imagining the desperation of those final minutes. Voices shouting over thunder, stone grinding under immense pressure, his father urging them through the opening. A hand reaching back for him before being pulled away by another rescuer who understood what Benjamin Hayes intended to do. He could envision the exact moment his father made his decision. There would have been no hesitation. That was the kind of man he was. The tunnel suddenly felt smaller as the truth pressed closer, forcing him to acknowledge what he needed to do next. His father's legacy did not belong forgotten underground. It deserved a life in the world above, told not in whispers, but in clear, undeniable fact. Yet the mountain had kept it guarded for a reason. Disturbing the balance could mean chaos. Journalists, treasure hunters, opportunists desecrating the peace of those laid to rest. Aaron hesitated, torn between duty to his father and respect for this ancient place. But he realized that his mission did not require exposing the sanctuary to exploitation. He could protect both honor and sanctity. He would give the journals and letters to authorities, to families, to those who had waited long enough for closure. But he would not reveal the exact path. The mountain had chosen him, just as it had chosen his father. He returned to the main tunnel and began securing the precious bundle within a waterproof compartment in his pack. He knew the journey upward would be harder, burdened not just with physical weight, but with the responsibility of carrying the lost. The sanctuary's silence seemed to acknowledge his choice. The air around him no longer felt suffocating. Rather, it embraced him with a calm warmth that belied the cold stone walls. He took one final look back into the chamber, imagining his father standing there, arms crossed, offering the proud yet stern look he used to give when Aaron finally mastered a new climbing technique. In that imagined gaze, there was approval, gratitude, love. Aaron whispered a promise into the darkness that he would return someday, and that the world would remember the truth. The sanctuary of forgotten lives would not remain forgotten any longer, not in the ways that mattered. Before he turned fully away, the beam of his light caught a final carving on the wall near the exit of the chamber. It was the same symbol he had seen repeatedly throughout the tunnel, 3 intersecting lines through a curved peak. But below it, etched with careful strokes, was a phrase translated across languages, old and new. The mountain remembers those who remember others. The words resonated deeply within him, a confirmation that the mountain did not only take, it also bore witness. And it gave back its truths to those willing to walk the path of sacrifice. Aaron touched the carving gently, then stepped into the corridor, inching upward with a strengthened heart. The rope trailing behind him felt like a lifeline connecting the past to the present. Every step carried him closer to the exit, and closer to the world where the truth would finally breathe free air again. The climb back would not be easy. Nothing worthwhile ever was, especially not in this realm of stone and shadow. But Aaron felt his father beside him with every movement. His father had held up the mountain. Now it was Aaron's turn to carry the mountain's story, and neither wind nor stone would stop him. Aaron began the return journey with a heavier pack than when he entered, though not because of the weight of paper and metal. The load he carried now pressed deeper, shaping the rhythm of his heartbeat, guiding the resolve in his every step. Behind him lay a sanctuary of souls that time had nearly erased, and ahead of him stretched a path filled with peril and purpose. He no longer walked merely as a climber or as a grieving son. He walked as the keeper of lost stories, entrusted with the lives and legacies of those who had never made it home. The passageway seemed different now, though nothing physical had changed. When he first crossed into this subterranean world, it had felt as though the mountain watched him with suspicion. Now, the darkness around him felt warmer, as if the rock itself acknowledged the significance of his burden. His headlamp beam wavered slightly as he adjusted its position. He was meticulous, making sure not to bump the fragile journal pages inside his pack. Every object he had gathered bore immeasurable weight, and he treated them with absolute reverence. The quiet remained unbroken except for the soft crunch of grit under his boots and the whisper of dust swirling through the air. Yet there was a presence here, not threatening, but attentive. He could not shake the feeling that the mountain understood what he intended to do. There had been a vow carved into the wall, a command for those who entered to respect the honor of the dead. And while the rescuers of the past had chosen secrecy to uphold that vow, Aaron believed that remembrance was also a form of honor. Letting these stories fade into silence felt like its own kind of betrayal. His breath was shallow at first, the weight of emotion gripping his lungs almost as tightly as the altitudinal strain. He inhaled deeply, grounding himself in the present. This was no dream. His father's badge was real. His journal was real. The map was real. And the mission he had carved out for himself now demanded courage every bit as fierce as any climb above daylight. As he continued upward along the narrow corridor, he replayed his father's last moments in his mind. Benjamin Hayes, rescuing those hikers, knowing full well that the only way to save them was to remain behind. Such a decision could only be made by someone who valued others' lives above his own. That was the truth Aaron had been denied for so long. He wondered how many nights his mother had cried herself to sleep, never knowing the reality of the man she loved. He imagined himself as a child again, searching the skies for signs that his father might still return. Now, years later, the mountain had answered those hopes, not with a reunion, but with a story that could finally let healing begin. He reached a turn where the corridor sloped more sharply upward. The temperature began to rise slightly, not enough to bring comfort, but enough to signal that the surface was closer than before. He paused for a moment to steady his breathing. The rope attached to his harness still extended back into the darkness, taut with the tension of unseen stone. He gave it one firm pull, verifying its stability, and continued. The climb became more demanding as he neared the entrance. What had been a careful descent was now a taxing ascent. Muscles in his arms and legs burned with the exertion, yet he embraced the pain. It reminded him that he was alive and that he had a duty to those who no longer were. He allowed himself brief moments of rest only when absolutely necessary, leaning against the cold walls and listening to the distant echo of his heartbeat. His thoughts drifted towards the people whose possessions he now carried, men and women who had braved these heights with hope in their chests. Some had likely believed they would conquer the mountain. Others may have known they were attempting the impossible. All had walked until the mountain demanded more than their strength could give. But now, in his hands, their voices still whispered. He imagined the moment he would hand over these journals to authorities, to families desperate for closure. He pictured the reunions, not with bodies or remains, but with the truth, the final words penned by trembling hands, the details that shaped their last days. He knew it would break hearts, but rebuilding always began after the breaking. As he climbed, he became aware of something else, an undercurrent of anxiety tugging at his thoughts. The sanctuary was a protected place. The rescuers had feared what might happen if the world knew of it. What if his decision to carry these stories into the light brought danger instead of honor? What if the sanctuary became a site of curiosity and profit, overrun by those seeking treasure rather than truth? He could not allow that to happen. He would need to choose carefully what to reveal and what to keep hidden. His arm brushed against the pack, feeling the firm outline of the journal pressed against the fabric. It grounded him. The promise he made earlier to his father returned to the forefront of his mind. The world deserved the truth. His father deserved justice. But the sanctuary deserved respect. Finally, the air shifted. A subtle breeze flowed down the tunnel, chilling his damp skin but bringing a sense of relief. Fresh air meant he was not far from the entrance. The darkness around him began to lighten into a deep gray, a whisper of daylight waiting ahead. His heartbeat quickened, not from fear but anticipation. He approached the opening cautiously, remembering how it had taken great effort to force the stone slab inward. Now he needed to push it outward again, hoping the mechanisms of the hidden entrance remained cooperative. He braced himself against the stone door and pushed. At first, nothing happened. Then the slab groaned, reluctant to leave its place after so many years. Dust rained down from the edges, and Aaron closed his eyes tightly, continuing to shove with every ounce of strength he had left. The mountain resisted one final time before yielding. A crack of light cut across the darkness, widening slowly as the slab slid outward. Aaron blinked as daylight flooded his vision. After so long underground, the sun felt blinding, overwhelming, magnificent. The cold air outside rushed into the tunnel, mixing with the stale breath of history that had clung for centuries inside. When the gap was wide enough, he squeezed through, emerging onto the narrow ledge where his journey had taken its abrupt turn. The storm had quieted but not disappeared. The sky was a swirling canvas of gray, clouds rolling over the peaks like restless spirit. The wind had weakened, though occasional gusts still reminded him that the mountain's temper was unpredictable. He turned back, watching as the stone slab settled loosely into place. With a quiet thud, the hidden entrance became, once again, nearly indistinguishable from the surrounding rock. Only the absence of the large fallen boulder hinted that anything had ever been different. Aaron took a moment to gather himself. He stood on shaking legs, gripping his ice axe for balance as he filled his lungs with the crisp air. A powerful wave of relief washed through him, followed quickly by an overwhelming pressure in his chest. He had made it out. The sanctuary was behind him. The truth was in his hands. Now he needed to survive the descent. The ledge felt narrower than before. The ground beneath his boots seemed more fragile, the rocks more eager to crumble. But he trusted his instincts. Slowly, he edged along, hugging the wall, repeating every practice move he had learned through years of climbing. The rope anchored him from above, though the tension had changed. The entrance was lower than where he had initially secured the line. He would have to rely more on his own balance than on his equipment. But he was ready. He had faced far worse inside. The storm rumbled distantly as he traveled lower. Snowflakes flurried past him, carried by the strengthening wind. Each one melted quickly against his skin, reminding him that he was still very much alive. He whispered thanks to the mountain, not for its mercy, but for its teachings. The mountain had shown him what sacrifice meant. It had tested him, pushed him, threatened him, and finally revealed the truth he had sought his entire life. Hours passed before his boots found wider, safer ground. When he reached the base of the steep cliff, he finally allowed himself to relax his posture. The tension that had held him rigid since the hidden door first revealed itself drained from his muscles. He removed his pack and set it carefully at his feet, kneeling beside it as though it were a companion he needed to reassure. For a few minutes, he simply knelt in silence, feeling the pulsing reality of everything he had endured. Images flashed through his mind, the journal entries, the personal items lying beside still, unburied bones, the quiet curve of his father's badge glinting in the beam of his light. He pressed his palm against the pack, a gesture both protective and grateful. He knew what came next. He needed to reach civilization. He needed to speak to those who could verify the documents and acknowledge the bravery concealed for so long. He needed to find the families waiting for something, anything, that would ease the ache of not knowing. When he finally stood again, he hoisted his pack and began the long descent. The world below was distant still, dotted with the faint suggestion of treetops and valleys shrouded in mist, but his steps were steady, strong, driven by purpose. He imagined how his father might have reacted to all of this. Benjamin Hayes would likely have brushed off any praise, insisting that he had only done his duty. Yet Aaron hoped he would approve of what his son now intended to do. He hoped that somewhere his father could see the determination in his stride, sense the love underpinning every choice he had made to uncover the truth. As he descended farther, the storm continued to ease, revealing patches of sky through the drifting clouds. The sun broke through in brief moments, casting golden light across the distant ridges. Aaron felt warmth against his cheeks and closed his eyes to let it sink into him. He allowed himself a small smile. He was no longer climbing toward answers. He was carrying them down. And though there were still challenges ahead, questions from authorities, skepticism from those unwilling to believe, and the responsibility of protecting the sanctuary from exploitation, he no longer feared any of it. He had walked the path of the dead and emerged with their stories. The mountain had trusted him to be their voice. That trust would not be broken. Ahead, the winding descent awaited him. Below, the world waited for truth. Aaron stepped forward with unwavering resolve, knowing that every step brought him closer to fulfilling the promise he had made in the heart of the mountain, that no name would be forgotten, that no sacrifice would fade, and that his father's legacy would finally rise from the shadows into the light. Aaron's descent stretched on through shifting weather and creeping fatigue, yet every step felt propelled by something greater than muscle or will. The mountain's weight, once a burden pressing against his chest, now felt like a guiding hand at his back. He carried its truth, fragile pages, tarnished metal, memories etched into paper and bone, all anchored carefully inside his pack. Each breath was a reminder that he had emerged from a place few would ever witness. The thin air stung his throat. His legs trembled beneath the strain, but determination steadied him more than any rope or anchor ever could. The rocky slopes below the hidden chamber were steep and unpredictable. The storm that had threatened earlier lingered at the horizon, simmering like a beast waiting for the chance to strike again. But for now, the wind had softened, and the sky allowed slivers of pale sunlight to peek through. The mountain seemed to be watching him closely, measuring his every movement, ensuring he remained worthy of the burden he carried. By the time Aaron reached a plateau wide enough to safely rest, the strain in his muscles had grown into a deep, satisfying ache. He set his pack down with gentle precision, the items inside too valuable, too precious to be handled with anything but care. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of everything he had survived and everything yet to come. He gazed at the jagged ridges towering above, where a hidden world lay behind perfectly carved stone. The thought that he had been among hollow-eyed guardians of mountain history only hours ago made the surface world feel unreal. Even the howl of the wind seemed different now, less menacing and more like a voice whispering from ancient depths. His father would have understood this moment. Aaron allowed himself a brief rest, sitting with his back propped against a boulder still cold from the night. The sanctuary below replayed in his memory, the quiet respect with which the dead had been arranged, the journals filled with trembling handwriting, the battered possessions that once meant everything to someone. He remembered the feel of his father's rescue badge in his hand, cold and undeniable, the final affirmation that Benjamin Hayes had not vanished senselessly. He had chosen his fate to save others. It was a truth that demanded daylight. He rose again, though every bone in his body begged for respite. But he had no intention of sleeping on this mountain, not tonight, not when the truth needed to breathe. A renewed focus steadied his breath and he moved forward, eyes scanning for the safest route down. His descent wound through spires of rock and patches of snow crusted with ice, each step a negotiation with the mountain. One wrong placement of his foot could turn this triumph into tragedy. But he no longer walked solely for himself. Fear became something small, something he acknowledged but did not bow to. Hours of descent blurred together. The wind grew louder, but it carried no malice now, more like a chorus urging him onward. When, at last, he spotted signs of human activity ahead, a cairn marking an official trail off in the distance, Aaron released a breath he had not realized he was holding. Civilization was close. Answers were close. The families whose tears had long dried from waiting would soon know the truth. The sun dipped lower, painting the mountain slopes in red and gold. Aaron welcomed the warmth against his face even as the shadows stretched across the valley below. His knees wobbled slightly from exhaustion, yet forward was the only direction he could imagine. He adjusted the straps of his pack and pushed on until the terrain eased into the more familiar path he had taken days earlier. Not long after he stepped onto the marked trail, Aaron spotted two figures moving toward him. Their bright jackets and purposeful gait identified them as climbers or rangers making their rounds. When they noticed him, one lifted their arm, signaling acknowledgement. Aaron returned the gesture weakly, relief flooding through him so intensely his vision blurred for a moment. By the time the two reached him, their expressions had shifted from curiosity to concern. Aaron must have looked dreadful, dust-covered, sweat-soaked, and visibly shaken. He struggled to form words, his throat thick with emotion he refused to release here, not yet. The older of the two rescuers placed a steady hand on Aaron's shoulder, guiding him to sit on a flat rock. Questions came cautiously. Are you injured? Do you need a medic? Did you fall? Where have you been? Aaron swallowed hard. He opened his pack just slightly and removed a single object, the rescue badge engraved with Benjamin Hayes's name. The rescuers exchanged baffled glances as Aaron struggled to find his voice. When he finally spoke, his words sounded distant, as though borrowed from another time. I found him. The rescuers didn't understand right away. How could they? So he began to explain, not everything at once, but enough to convey the urgency of his discovery. The journals, the remains, the sanctuary hidden deep within the mountain. The truth that had been buried in silence for far too long. When they finally began to grasp the magnitude of what he said, their eyes widened with a mixture of disbelief and awe. One immediately radioed for assistance, his voice trembling as he relayed details. Aaron listened faintly, every muscle in his body numb with exhaustion. Soon, more voices crackled through the air, orders given, coordinates gathered. The mountain's quiet realm was about to collide with the world of sirens and protocol. Aaron hoped desperately that the sanctity of the sanctuary would not be trampled in the rush, but he also knew that the families deserved to know. Within the hour, search and rescue teams arrived. Aaron was given water and a blanket to wrap around his shoulders. The adrenaline that had fueled him for so long ebbed away, leaving behind sheer fatigue. Yet, he stayed alert as he guided the officials through what he could remember of the hidden entrance, explaining that parts of the route were unstable. The rescue chief, a stern man with deep lines etched across his face, locked eyes with Aaron and nodded firmly. There would be careful planning before anyone entered. Soon after, an officer arrived from the nearest town. He sat beside Aaron on a portable chair set up hastily in the clearing. He listened with unwavering focus as Aaron carefully recounted the events underground. Nothing was dismissed or doubted. Aaron could see the wheels turning. The officer understood this was bigger than a missing climber case. This was a revelation buried under years of misreported tragedy. Night had fallen by the time they escorted Aaron down from the mountain to the base station. The lights felt harsh after so long in dimness. People scurried around with urgent purpose as call after call was made. Experts would arrive, archaeologists, anthropologists, forensics teams, families of missing climbers would be notified. A new chapter in the mountain's history was unfolding. But, through the flurry of activity, Aaron was guided into a quiet corner and offered food and medical evaluation. He was exhausted, yet his thoughts refused to still. He imagined his mother. What would he say to her? How could he tell her that the man she had mourned was a hero beyond what anyone had ever told her? She deserved the truth first, before the world clamored for pieces of it. Hours later, when the reports were underway and officials confirmed there would be a full investigation, Aaron sat outside beneath the stars, wrapped in a foil blanket and watching the mountain rise dark and enormous against the night sky. The air was crisp, scented with pine and earth. He let his mind wander back to that underground hall of silence and to the inscription that had guided him onward. The mountain remembers those who remember others. His father was remembered. His sacrifice would never again be hidden behind administrative oversight or lost beneath bureaucratic indifference. And those who had been buried beside him would finally have their names spoken aloud once more. Aaron understood then that his father's legacy was not only carved into that stone sanctuary, but into the hearts of those who would now learn his story. In the days that followed, the world transformed around him. He gave interviews, answered every question authorities posed, and provided maps and journals to investigators. Word spread quickly that a mysterious chamber had been found deep in the Andes, containing remains of climbers missing for decades. News cameras eventually arrived, but Aaron kept distance, refusing to sensationalize tragedy. He explained only what honored the dead, nothing more. He did not reveal the exact location, insisting the mountain maintain its guardianship over that sacred place. When the official recognition finally came, it was in a small ceremony attended by rescuers, families of the lost, and a handful of officials. Benjamin Hayes was honored with a posthumous commendation, acknowledging his sacrifice, his leadership, and his courage. Aaron watched as his mother accepted the medal, her hands trembling and tears streaking down her face. Not tears of grief this time, but tears of completeness. She finally knew where her husband had fallen and why. The wound of uncertainty had been closed. Aaron stood by her side, feeling the ghost of his father's warm, steady hand on his shoulder. He no longer needed to search for the truth. It lived in him now. Though the ceremony eventually ended and the people dispersed, Aaron remained looking up at the distant ridgeline, where the mountain concealed its deepest truths. He understood, in a way he never had before, that his life had been changed forever. The boy who lost his father to the mountains had become the man who returned with his memory preserved. The path ahead was still uncertain, but Aaron knew he would continue climbing, not to seek answers anymore, but to honor the bond carved in stone. One evening, after the investigations had slowed and the world began shifting back to its usual pace, Aaron found himself hiking once more towards the foothills. He didn't go far, just enough to find a quiet place to sit and watch the sunset reflect across the granite peaks. The golden light flickered across the mountainside like a heartbeat, alive, ancient, unyielding. He whispered softly into the wind, "I remember." The breeze carried his words upward, weaving them into the high, unreachable places where memory lives forever. The mountain had spoken its truth, and he had listened. Now the world would listen too. The mountain may have revealed its truth today, but many more mysteries remain. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Keep watching. Your next discovery is just one click away. And don't forget to share this video. The world deserves to know.